Hello and welcome. My name is John Larson. I'm a legal program manager at the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Shane Reeder, a policy scientist and legal epidemiologist committed to promoting health and opportunity in Texas. Dr. Reeder currently serves as a graduate Archer Fellow in Washington, D.C. at the University of Texas Archer Center. His research interests include mental health, infectious disease, emergency preparedness, and health law. Dr. Reeder recently published research from the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston School of Public Health on Good Samaritan overdose prevention laws in drug and alcohol dependence that reveals patterns in implementation, facilitates future evaluations, and produces a roadmap for the dimension reduction of further policy surveillance datasets related to harm reduction and drug use. With that, I want to get into your research, Dr. Reeder. Can you describe the key findings of your recent research on Good Samaritan laws?
Thank you, John. It's great to be here. So I'd actually like to take a step back before I talk about the key findings. As you said in my introduction, I focus specifically on laws impact my communities here in Texas. And that's really the context for this research. We did have a 911 Good Samaritan law, which was passed in the 2021 Texas state legislative session. These are laws which provide limited immunity for certain criminal offenses and criminal consequences to people who are calling 911 to report an overdose, even if they might have drugs in their pocket. But my community was pretty frustrated by the shape this law took when it was passed in Texas. It has really prolific exemptions that exclude a lot of people who are the most vulnerable. It excludes people as a function of how much, what quantity of opioids a person has in their pocket, by their criminal history, and even based on whether or not they've made another 911 call, a completely unrelated 911 call in the past 18 months. And so that really got me started looking at the policy surveillance in this space. And I found that there are a lot of features of these laws, like these features I was describing here in Texas, which have been overlooked in the literature. And so that's really what this research is about. That's our key findings here, is that while we might look at whether or not a state has a given 911 Good Samaritan law, we might look and say, like, well, Kansas and Wyoming are the only states to date which have not adopted such a protection. In fact, there's so much more variance within these laws than there is when we're just looking at whether or not a state has adopted such a policy. We have laws like what we have here in Texas, which offer extremely minimal protections, even for people who are qualified to receive immunity. The immunity they receive is only a defense to prosecution, meaning they are still vulnerable to arrest, to being held in jail, compared to other states which have much stronger protections. Protections which, for instance, protect them from being arrested at the scene of the offense in the first place. Other states have immense burdens they place on the reporter. They might need to be the first person to call 911. They need to cooperate in any investigation which arises from the 911 call. And many states have burdens that go beyond the offense itself. For instance, the person might need to receive substance use disorder treatment in order to maintain their immunity. So the key finding here is that these laws really cannot be grouped under one name. Calling these overdose bystander laws or 911 Good Samaritan laws really irons over a lot of key differences that influence whether or not a person has immunity. And I think it's going to change whether or not they're willing to call 911 to report an overdose in the first place.
Thanks, Dr. Reeder. That's really important work and insight. Now, can you describe how you have utilized policy surveillance in your research and how you chose policy surveillance as a tool?
Absolutely. So my background is psychology, and that's all we talk about. We talk about how to take something that is qualitative in nature, take an idea like self-esteem or locus of control or what features are associated with your zodiac sign, and figure out how to actually quantify that, to put that into numbers which we can measure and associate with downstream behavior. how well you feel you're going to perform at this given task, whether you believe that your actions are really your choice or whether they're a function of the universe, whether or not I'm as ambitious and creative as an Aquarius is supposed to be, right? Taking these abstract concepts and decomposing them into something we can measure. And so when I got into health policy, I was naturally drawn to policy surveillance. That's all policy surveillance is taking something qualitative, the actual text of a law or a regulation, and decomposing it into a spreadsheet. And so that's what I've done with the 911 Good Samaritan Law Inventory. I'm very proud of the work there. And it codifies all the unique little features and caveats and strengths and novelties that characterize these laws across all the states. So this is absolutely a work of policy surveillance. What I really wanted to do is to contribute a new way of thinking about surveillance, which is instead of identifying a protocol a priori to identify the most salient features of these laws and decompose them into 6, 8, 10 variables, what this policy surveillance dataset does is codify them across 120 some odd variables, which are based on reading every single law and attempting to amplify these differences rather than iron across them. I chose policy surveillance as a tool because, like I said, I'm very motivated by the issues which are impactful for my community. I'm really fortunate to be a member of a lot of community-based organizations which advocate for causes that are influential over the lives of people who have substance use disorder. And that is specific here to Texas, where this law that we have in place right now, we believe it really excludes a lot of people who are the most disenfranchised by substance use policy here in Texas. And so the purpose of using policy surveillance is to make sure that what we're doing is really identifying best practices, that we are looking at the way these laws are structured across states in order to provide a framework for advocates here in Texas to improve the law. What works, what doesn't, what can we identify in the laws which are in place in, for instance, Vermont or Washington, D.C. or Washington State that we can bring home here to Texas. That's the purpose of using policy surveillance specifically in this research.
Fascinating. That's really, really helpful insight. How can this research inform policymaking decisions moving forward with Samaritan laws?
Absolutely. That's really what I want this to do. I want this research to isolate the actual practices which are associated with saving the most lives downstream. Now, we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. As you know, the latest study I published in this space was a dimension reduction analysis. So I have this giant policy surveillance data set, which, like I said, is more than 100 variables cataloging all the weird little features in these laws and how they differ across states. And the challenge is that a lot of our traditional methods in legal epidemiology to associate these laws with downstream outcomes are not very easily applicable to data, which is just so weird. It is first of all, it's very multivariate. There are so many variables that we've measured. It's longitudinal. We're measuring this information across time. And so many of these little features are unique to just one particular state, right? And the traditional methods we use in legal epi just simply are not able to accommodate that kind of data. So the purpose of this most recent study was to take this really wild, really crunchy data and reduce it almost like cooking down a pasta sauce on the stove to a rich and much more manageable data set. So we've really identified 5 forms these laws take. And if you want a little bit more information, I won't bore you about that. You can go read the article. But the next stage of this research is to associate the different forms these laws take with different outcomes downstream. Specifically, we'll be looking, of course, at overdose mortality. And so that research is currently being peer reviewed. I won't spoil it here, but I think that what we've done is identify certain best practices in these laws, which really do save lives downstream. And the purpose of demonstrating these methods of sharing these dimension reduction techniques is to then take that and apply that to different policy surveillance data sets in the future. That can be in related spaces, for instance, naloxone access laws, prescription drug monitoring programs, these other things which are similarly in the controlled substance space. But I also want to apply these techniques to disparate domains, firearms, reproductive healthcare access, these kinds of things, in order to help us make the best use of the policy surveillance data that we have. What I can say is substantiated by qualitative evidence. Again, this quantitative evidence will be coming down the pipeline. I'll be super excited to share that when that study has been published. But for now, what we can do is we can amplify the voices of people who are in these communities on the ground. They do not have trust in law enforcement. They are concerned that if they call the police, they're going to experience downstream consequences, whether that is direct criminalization, being arrested, being prosecuted, and put in prison for possession of controlled substances, or that could be consequences that are outside of the justice process, losing your housing if you have a publicly supported housing program, or losing your ability to go to school if you're in a college that has behavior codes, these kinds of things that are real challenges. And so what we can tell right now from the voices of people who are impacted by these laws is that across the United States right now, there are too many laws which center compliance, they center authority. They don't give people the basic compassion they need to feel comfortable calling police in the event of an emergency. And so I really hope that when people go back to these laws, or when advocates on the ground consider what they want to change, that we can strengthen them. Instead of offering a protection from prosecution after a person has been arrested, we can offer protection from arrest in the first place. There's no reason necessarily to omit somebody from protection because they have a previous controlled substance offense, or they've been previously placed on probation. And certainly in Texas, there's no reason a person should be ineligible for protection from our overdose bystander law simply because they called 911 in the past 18 months, especially for something that could be completely unrelated. So that's really what I hope comes out of this research, is to strengthen these laws to help people feel confident that they'll be safe if they're calling 911 to report an overdose. That's how we're going to save lives.
Thank you so much for sharing your research. It's so important to amplify the law in this way, and to really dig into the detail to find solutions. So really appreciate you sharing your research with us. Please visit Dr. Reeder's blog on phlr.org. Which also will have a link to the research that Dr. Reeder was discussing, and also visit pdaps.org for more legal research.